My son told me I was too poor to attend his wedding, so I sent him a gift he'll regret refusing for the rest of his life. Before I continue my story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. I still remember exactly where I was standing when my son Trevor broke my heart. It was a Tuesday afternoon in April, and I was in my workshop behind the house. The place where I'd spent thousands of hours teaching him how to build things with his own two hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. My phone buzzed with his name on the screen. I smiled, wiping sawdust from my fingers before answering. Trevor had been distant these past few years, ever since he'd started dating Melissa, a real estate agent from one of those families where everyone had perfect teeth and summer homes. "Dad," he said, his voice sounding oddly formal, "I'm calling about the wedding." My heart lifted. Finally, after months of hearing nothing about their engagement except through Facebook posts, I thought I was getting an invitation, maybe even a request to be his best man. After all, it had been just Trevor and me against the world since his mother passed away when he was 12. "The invitations went out yesterday," he continued, his voice strangely flat. "But I wanted to call you personally rather than having you receive the news by mail." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. "Receive what news, son?" A pause stretched between us, filled only by the sound of his breathing. "Melissa and I have been talking, and we think it would be best if you didn't attend the ceremony or reception." The workshop seemed to tilt around me. I gripped the edge of my workbench to steady myself. "What are you talking about?" "Not attend my only son's wedding, Dad. It's at the Bellevue Hotel. The guests are mostly Melissa's family's business associates and friends. Her father is paying for everything, and it's going to be very upscale." "And what, you think I'll embarrass you? I own a suit, Trevor. I know which fork to use." I tried to keep my voice light, though my chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice. Another silence. Then, "It's not just that, Dad. Melissa's parents are inviting a lot of important people, investment bankers, real estate developers. This is a networking opportunity for us. I don't understand what that has to do with me being there." But the terrible truth was, I was beginning to understand exactly what he meant. "Dad," Trevor said, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear, "you're a carpenter. You live in a small house in a working-class neighborhood. You drive a 20-year-old truck. Melissa's family, they're different. This wedding is costing her father over $100,000. The blood rushed to my face. "And that makes me what? Unworthy to see my son get married?" "That's not what I'm saying," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just ... appearances matter in their world. I'm trying to build a future with them. Can't you understand that?" "What I understand," I said slowly, "is that you're ashamed of me, of how I live, of what I do for a living. The same living that put food in your mouth and clothes on your back for 18 years. Dad, please, don't make this harder than it already is. We'll have a private dinner or something after the honeymoon. Just the three of us." I looked around at my workshop, at the handmade furniture I'd poured my heart into creating, at the wall of photos showing Trevor growing up, Trevor with his first bicycle I'd saved 6 months to buy him, Trevor at his high school graduation in the suit I'd worked overtime to afford, Trevor moving into his college dorm, his tuition paid by the second mortgage on my house. "Do you remember your 10th birthday?" I asked quietly. "Dad, do you remember what I gave you? That handmade chess set. I worked on it for months after you went to bed, carved each piece by hand." "I remember," he said softly. "Look, this isn't personal, not personal." My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. "You're telling me I'm too poor, too working class, too embarrassing to attend your wedding, my only child's wedding. How is that not personal? Melissa's father is an important man, Dad. He's offering me a position in his company after the wedding. I can't risk what? Having people know you're the son of someone who works with his hands for a living, someone who sacrificed everything so you could go to college, so you wouldn't have to struggle like I did." I could hear him talking to someone in the background, Melissa. No doubt, her voice sharp with irritation. "I have to go," Trevor said. "I'm sorry you feel this way. The invitation decision is final. I hope you'll reconsider your attitude about this. It's just one day." "One day," I echoed. "Your wedding day? The day I've thought about since you were born." "I'll call you next week," he said, and then he was gone. I stood there in my workshop, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent building things to last, including, I had thought, my relationship with my son. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the sound of my heart cracking in two. My phone buzzed again, a text message from Trevor. Please don't reach out to Melissa or her family about this. It would only make things worse. I set my phone down on the workbench and walked outside. The spring air felt cool against my face, which was burning with a potent mixture of shame, hurt, and something else beginning to spark in my chest. Something that felt like determination. If I wasn't good enough to attend his wedding, maybe it was time my son learned exactly what poor really meant, and exactly what he was throwing away. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Trevor's face, not the grown man who had just broken my heart, but the little boy who used to run into my arms whenever I came home from work. The boy who thought I hung the moon. By morning, I had moved past shock into a simmering anger. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, the same oak table I'd crafted when Trevor was in high school. On its surface were 3 scratches from when he'd carelessly dropped his car keys over and over, despite my asking him not to. I'd never repaired those scratches. They were part of our story. I opened my filing cabinet and began pulling out folders, bank statements, mortgage documents, education savings accounts. I spread them across the table, creating a paper trail of sacrifices that stretched back 28 years. The first document was Trevor's birth certificate. Martha, my late wife, had insisted on a copy for me to keep in my wallet, which I still did, worn and faded though it was now. Martha had died when Trevor was 12, breast cancer that moved too quickly for treatments to stop. Her medical bills had nearly bankrupted me, but I'd paid every last one. The next folder contained the deed to our house. A modest 3-bedroom in a middle-class neighborhood with decent schools. I'd bought it when Trevor was 4, stretching myself thin with the mortgage payments because Martha insisted our son deserved to grow up in a stable environment with his own room and a backyard. I ran my finger over the mortgage statement. 28 years of payments. I'd finally paid it off just last year. Next came the education folder. Statements from the 529 plan I'd started the month Trevor was born. Every spare dollar going into that account instead of retirement savings or home improvements. Tuition payments to Westridge Academy, the private high school Martha had been set on, believing it would give Trevor his best shot at a good college. $24,300 per year for 4 years, almost $100,000 then college. Trevor had gotten into Northeastern University, not quite Ivy League, but prestigious enough to make me burst with pride. The financial aid package had been meager. My income as a master carpenter put us just above the cutoff for significant help, $58,000 per year for 4 years, another $232,000. The second mortgage I'd taken out to cover what the 529 plan couldn't. The home equity line of credit, the personal loans, all paid back by working 60-hour weeks and taking every high-end commission I could get, despite the toll it took on my back and knees. Medical expenses when Trevor broke his leg skiing during spring break of his sophomore year. $18,000. Out of pocket because he'd somehow been dropped from my insurance during an employer change. The down payment for his first apartment in Boston after graduation, $12,000. The loan I'd given him to buy his first car, $22,000. Still unpaid. The credit card debt I'd accumulated buying plane tickets to visit him at school, to attend his graduation, to help him move, the interest I was still paying. All told, I had spent over $400,000 on my son's upbringing and education, more than the value of my house, more than my retirement account, more than I would likely earn in the remaining years of my working life. And now I was too poor to attend his wedding. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of these numbers pressing on my chest. It wasn't about the money. I had never once regretted a single dollar spent on Trevor. What broke my heart was that after all this sacrifice, he could dismiss me so easy, that he could be ashamed of me, of the very things I had done to give him a better life than mine. The worst part was that I had succeeded. I'd raised a son who had moved so far beyond my world that he no longer saw a place for me in his. My coffee had gone cold. I pushed aside the papers and pulled out my phone. No missed calls. No texts saying he'd made a terrible mistake. Just the background image, Trevor, at his college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us smiling. I'd never seen him look so proud. Or maybe he'd just been proud of himself, not of me. Never of me. I opened my contacts and scrolled past Trevor's name. I hadn't called my attorney in years, not since finalizing the payoff on the second mortgage. But suddenly, I needed legal advice, because something had shifted inside me. Something fundamental. If Trevor was old enough to decide I wasn't good enough for his wedding, then he was old enough to stand on his own 2 feet. Completely. It was time he understood exactly what he was throwing away. Not just his father's presence at his wedding, but everything that came with being my son, including his inheritance. My attorney, Richard Kleinman, had been handling my legal affairs for over 20 years. He'd helped me through Martha's estate, the various mortgages and loans, and had even drawn up my will when Trevor turned 18. He listened silently as I explained the situation, his face carefully neutral in the way that only lawyers can manage. "Let me make sure I understand correctly," he said when I finished. "Your son has explicitly uninvited you from his wedding because you're not wealthy or prestigious enough for his fiancée's family, and now you want to change your will." "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want to remove Trevor as my beneficiary." Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Frank, I've known you a long time. You've worked incredibly hard to provide for your son. Are you sure you want to take such a drastic step over what might be a temporary lapse in judgment on his part? It's not just the wedding, Richard. It's what it represents. The absolute dismissal of everything I am, everything I've done for him. I raised that boy by myself after Martha died. I put him through private school, then an expensive college. I've supported his every dream, his every ambition, even when it took him further and further from my world." I pulled out my phone and showed him the text Trevor had sent. "Please don't reach out to Melissa or her family about this. It would only make things worse." "He's ashamed of me," I said, the words still painful to speak aloud, "to the point where he doesn't even want his future in-laws to meet me. How do you come back from that?" Richard sighed, reaching for a legal pad. "All right, let's discuss your assets. There's your house, which is now fully paid off and worth approximately $380,000 in today's market. Your retirement accounts, which total around $210,000, less than ideal for your age, but understandable given the financial sacrifices you've made for Trevor. Your workshop and tools, which have significant value. And of course, the land in Vermont. 100 acres of pristine forest and meadowland alongside a crystal-clear lake. Passed down through my father's family for generations. Worth well over $1 million now, as developers had been salivating over the property for years, sending me increasingly generous offers to sell. "Does Trevor know about the Vermont property?" Richard asked. "No," I admitted. "My father made me promise to keep it quiet until I was ready to pass it on. Too many relatives came out of the woodwork when they realized its value. I was planning to tell Trevor after he settled down, started a family. I always imagined building a cabin there together, something he could take his own children to someday. A dream that now felt like ashes in my mouth." "And you want to remove him as beneficiary from everything?" Richard asked, his pen poised above the legal pad. I hesitated, the finality of it giving me pause. "Not exactly. I have a different idea." Over the next hour, I outlined my plan to Richard. It wasn't about disinheriting Trevor completely. It was about teaching him a lesson about values, about what really matters in life, about the true meaning of wealth. "This is unusually specific," Richard said when I finished. "Are you sure this is how you want to proceed?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I replied. "It will take me about a week to draw up the necessary documents," he said. "In the meantime, I strongly suggest you sleep on this decision." But as I drove home from his office, I knew no amount of sleep would change my mind. The wound Trevor had inflicted went too deep. It wasn't just about missing his wedding day, it was about being erased from his life story. About being deemed insufficient despite every sacrifice I'd made. When I got home, I went straight to my workshop. There, hanging on the wall, was the first project Trevor and I had ever completed together, a simple birdhouse. Painted bright blue because it was Martha's favorite color. He'd been 8 years old, so proud of the crooked roof and uneven perch. Below it sat the last thing we'd worked on together before he left for college, an intricately carved jewelry box for his then-girlfriend. He'd lost interest halfway through, leaving me to finish the detailed inlay work myself. I'd shipped it to him at school, and he'd texted a quick thanks without ever mentioning the hours of labor it represented. Maybe that should have been my first clue that his values were changing, that he was already beginning to measure worth in dollars rather than devotion. I took down the birdhouse and placed it on my workbench. Then I began gathering wood and tools with a renewed sense of purpose. I would make one final gift for my son, something to commemorate his wedding day, something that would, eventually, show him exactly what he had thrown away when he decided I wasn't good enough to witness him say I do. And when the time came, when he finally understood the full magnitude of his mistake, it would be too late to undo it. The next 3 months passed in a strange blur of purposeful action and emotional numbness. Trevor called exactly twice during this period, brief, Awkward conversations where he never once mentioned his decision to exclude me from his wedding. Instead, he talked about honeymoon plans, 2 weeks in the Maldives, courtesy of Melissa's parents, and the penthouse condo they were buying with a substantial down payment from her father. "We've got 4 bedrooms, he mentioned during our second call. "Plenty of space when we decide to have kids." I bit back the response that rose to my lips. Will those future grandchildren be allowed to know their working-class grandfather? Or will I be too embarrassing for them too? Instead, I said, "That sounds nice," and changed the subject to safer territory. Meanwhile, I spent every evening and weekend in my workshop, channeling all my hurt and anger into creating a masterpiece, a handcrafted chest made from the finest maple I could source. With intricate inlay work using exotic woods from around the world, inside, hidden compartments accessible only if you knew their secrets. A physical metaphor for the hidden wealth Trevor had never suspected, wealth he was now at risk of losing forever. The final touch was the engraving on the inside of the lid. True wealth is measured by more than money. When the chest was finished, I lined it with velvet and placed inside it several items. First, a sealed envelope containing the new terms of my will, officially notarized and legally binding. Second, a USB drive containing digital copies of every receipt, bank statement, and financial record documenting the money I had spent raising and educating Trevor, a grand total of $427,893. Third, a leather-bound album with photographs charting our life together. Trevor on my shoulders at his first baseball game. Trevor and me camping in the backyard. Trevor standing proudly beside the treehouse we'd built together. Trevor in his cap and gown, my arm around his shoulders, both of us smiling for the camera. Fourth, a hand-drawn map of the Vermont property, along with the original deed showing its passage through 5 generations of our family. And finally, at the bottom of the chest, the key to a safe deposit box containing one additional document, the means through which Trevor might, if he chose wisely, reclaim what he was about to lose. 1 week before the wedding, I carefully wrapped the chest in simple brown paper and attached a card, "To Trevor and Melissa, a handmade gift from the hands you consider unworthy to witness your vows. This chest contains your true inheritance. Open it only when you are both ready to understand its value." Dad and I arranged for the package to be delivered to their penthouse condo on the morning of their wedding day, knowing they would be busy with preparations and likely set it aside until after the honeymoon. That would give me time for the second phase of my plan. The wedding day itself was the hardest day I'd endured since Martha's funeral. I spent it in my workshop, methodically cleaning and organizing my tools while imagining Trevor standing at the altar, Melissa by his side, surrounded by wealthy strangers who knew nothing of the sacrifices that had shaped him into the man he had become. Around the time they would be saying their vows, I picked up my phone and sent him a simple text. "I love you enough to respect your decision today. I hope someday you'll understand the true cost of the choice you've made." He didn't respond. That evening, as they celebrated at their lavish reception, I drove to my bank and accessed my own safe deposit box. Inside was the document Richard had drawn up per my instructions. The transfer of the Vermont property to a newly established trust. A trust that Trevor would know nothing about until it was almost too late. The following morning, while the newlyweds jetted off to their luxury honeymoon, I made one final call to a real estate developer who had been trying to purchase my Vermont land for years. "Mr. Harrison," I said when he answered, "I believe you've made several offers on my property in Green Mountains." "Mr. Calloway," he replied, clearly surprised to hear from me after years of rejected offers. "Yes, our offer still stands at $1.8 million. But we'd be willing to negotiate." "I'm not selling," I interrupted. "Not yet. But I wanted to let you know the property might be coming available in about 4 months. There's a specific process that will need to be followed if you're interested." "What kind of process?" he asked, confusion evident in his voice. "All in good time, Mr. Harrison," I replied. "Let's just say the land's future depends on whether its value is truly understood by its rightful heir." I hung up before he could ask more questions, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The plan was in motion now. All that remained was to wait for Trevor to discover what he had so carelessly discarded, and what it would cost him to make things right. Trevor and Melissa returned from their honeymoon tanned, refreshed, and, according to social media, blissfully happy. I knew this not because my son had bothered to call me, but because I'd created a fake Facebook profile to monitor their posts, something I wasn't proud of, but necessary to time the next phase of my plan. From their photos, it was clear they were settling into a life of privilege I could barely comprehend. weekend brunches at exclusive restaurants, a shopping spree where Melissa modeled a dress that probably cost more than I earned in a month, Trevor posing in front of his new office at his father-in-law's development company, wearing a suit I'd never seen before. Not once did either of them mention the wedding gift I'd sent. Either they hadn't opened it yet, or they had and were choosing to ignore its contents. Either way, it was time to force the issue. 3 weeks after their return, I finally received a text from Trevor. "Dad, we need to talk about the chest you sent. Can we meet somewhere?" I waited a full day before responding. "My house. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. His reply was immediate. "We can't come to your neighborhood at night. Can we meet at the Capitol Grill downtown instead?" The implications stung, even now. My neighborhood, the one where he'd grown up, where I'd raised him by myself after his mother died, was apparently too dangerous or too shabby for his new life. "This isn't a discussion to have in a restaurant," I texted back. "My house or not at all." After a long pause, "Fine, we'll be there." The next evening, I prepared carefully for their visit. I didn't clean the house beyond my usual standards. I wanted them to see exactly how I lived, with no pretense or apology. I set out coffee and the homemade apple pie that had been Trevor's favorite since childhood, though I doubted Melissa would touch either. At 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes late, a sleek black Audi pulled into my driveway. Trevor emerged from the driver's side, looking uncomfortable in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably costs more than all the clothes in my closet combined. Melissa followed, her expression making it clear she'd rather be anywhere else. I opened the door before they could knock. "You're late," I said simply. "Traffic," Trevor muttered, though we all knew that was a lie. He hesitated at the threshold, as if unsure whether to hug me, then simply nodded and stepped inside, Melissa trailing behind him like she might catch something from touching my furniture. They sat stiffly on the couch. The same couch where I'd read Trevor bedtime stories, where I'd comforted him through his first heartbreak, where we'd watched the Super Bowl together every year until he left for college. Between us, on the coffee table, sat the chest I'd crafted, removed from its brown paper wrapping but still closed. "I see you got my gift," I said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Trevor cleared his throat. "Yes, it's beautiful craftsmanship, Dad. Thank you. Have you opened it?" I asked, already knowing the answer from his body language. "We did," he admitted, exchanging a glance with Melissa. "That's why we're here." "I see." I leaned back in my chair, waiting. Let them do the talking. "Frank," Melissa spoke for the first time, her voice tight with forced politeness, "we appreciate the gesture, but we're a bit confused about the contents." "What's confusing?" I asked mildly. I thought the letter from Richard was quite clear. Trevor's jaw tightened. "You're disinheriting me because I didn't invite you to our wedding. Don't you think that's extreme? Is that what you think this is about?" I asked, my calm beginning to crack. "Just the wedding invitation. What else would it be about?" Melissa interjected, her facade of politeness slipping. I looked directly at my son. "Trevor, what did you tell her about why I wasn't at the wedding?" He shifted uncomfortably. "I told her you couldn't make it." "Couldn't make it," I repeated slowly. "Not that you explicitly uninvited me because I'm a working-class carpenter who might embarrass you in front of her wealthy family. Not that you told me I was too poor to attend my only son's wedding." Melissa's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up and she turned to Trevor. "You said he had a work emergency, that he chose not to come." Trevor had the decency to look ashamed. "I was trying to avoid drama by lying to your new wife. That seems like a solid foundation for a marriage." I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "Look," Trevor said, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation, "what's done is done. But this," he gestured to the chest, "this is going too far. You're going to cut me out of your will over one mistake?" "One mistake." I leaned forward. "Trevor, you didn't forget my birthday. You deliberately excluded me from one of the most important days of your life because you were ashamed of me. After everything I've sacrificed to give you the opportunities that led you to your fancy office and your penthouse condo." "Sacrificed?" Melissa scoffed. "From what Trevor's told me, you've always been, comfortable. Maybe not wealthy, but hardly struggling." I stared at her, then at my son, realization dawning. "Is that what you've told people? That you grew up comfortable? That I didn't nearly break myself paying for your education, your lifestyle?" "Dad, come on," Trevor said, an edge of desperation in his voice. "That's not relevant anymore. I'm doing well now. We're doing well. Thanks to your father-in-law," I pointed out, "not through anything you've earned on your own." Melissa stood up abruptly. "This was a mistake. We should go. Sit down." I said quietly, with such authority that she actually obeyed. You haven't heard the most important part yet. I reached across and opened the chest, removing the map of the Vermont property and placing it on the table between us. Do you know what this is? Trevor glanced at it briefly. Some land in Vermont. Is this supposed to be significant? 100 acres of prime lakefront property that's been in our family for 5 generations. Conservatively worth around $2 million in today's market. Possibly much more to the right developer. I watched as this information registered on their faces. It would have been yours eventually. All of it? Trevor stared at the map, then at me, shock written across his features. $2 million, why didn't you ever tell me about this? I was saving it for when you were mature enough to appreciate its true value, not just its monetary worth, but what it represents, our family's heritage. A legacy to pass down to your children someday. And now, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now it's been placed in a trust with very specific conditions. I handed him another document from the chest. In exactly 60 days, this property will be sold to Harrison Development Group. They've been after it for years, planning to build luxury condos and a golf course. The proceeds will go to the scholarship fund. I've established 4 underprivileged students pursuing careers in the trades. You can't do that, Melissa said, color rising in her cheeks. It's your son's birthright. It was, I agreed, until he decided I wasn't good enough to be acknowledged as his father in public. There must be something we can do, Trevor said, desperation creeping into his voice as the reality of what he was losing began to sink in. Some way to stop this. There is. I reached into the chest one final time and removed a small, sealed envelope. The key in this envelope opens a safe deposit box containing the only document that can halt the sale. But to access it, you'll need to fulfill certain conditions. What conditions? Trevor asked warily. That's for you to discover, I said, rising from my chair. Consider it a puzzle. Not unlike the hidden compartments in the chest I made you. The solution requires you to truly understand the lessons you've apparently forgotten. This is ridiculous, Melissa snapped. We could challenge this legally. Your father-in-law wouldn't want the publicity. I cut in smoothly. Imagine the headlines. Prominent developers, son-in-law disowns blue-collar father. Loses millions. Not exactly the image your family tries to project, is it? She fell silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Trevor looked lost. Like the little boy who used to come to me with skinned knees and broken toys. Dad, please, just tell me what you want me to do. I want you to figure it out for yourself, I said, softening slightly at his genuine distress. The answers are all there, in that chest. Everything you need to know about what really matters in this life. I walked to the front door and opened it, a clear dismissal. 60 days, Trevor. The clock is ticking. As they left, I saw Trevor clutch the chest to his chest like a lifeline, the map of the Vermont property protruding from beneath his arm. The seeds had been planted. Now I had to wait and see if my son was capable of understanding the true nature of wealth and family before it was too late. For the next 2 weeks, I heard nothing from Trevor or Melissa. I continued my daily routine, working in my shop, having dinner with friends, volunteering at the community center, teaching woodworking to at-risk teenagers, the same modest, fulfilling life I'd always led, the life my son had deemed insufficient for his new social circle. Then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Trevor appeared at my workshop door alone. He looked different, tired, less polished than during his previous visit. His designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a simple button-down shirt that reminded me of what he used to wear in college. Can I come in? He asked hesitantly. I nodded, setting aside the cabinet door I'd been sanding. No Melissa today. She doesn't know I'm here, he admitted, stepping inside and looking around the workshop with what seemed like fresh eyes. I needed to talk to you alone. I gestured to the workbench stool. Have a seat. He sat, running his fingers over the worn wood of my workbench, tracing the patterns of nicks and stains that told the story of decades of craftsmanship. I've been going through everything in the chest, he said finally. All the financial records, the photos. I had no idea. No idea about what? I asked, though I knew perfectly well. About how much you spent on me, on my education, the second mortgage, the loans, ... double quotes. He swallowed hard. I guess I never really thought about where the money came from. I just assumed ... that it appeared by magic. I suggested. That's the privilege of childhood. Trevor, you're not supposed to worry about those things. But at some point, you should have at least acknowledged the sacrifices. I know that now, he said quietly, Reading through those bank statements, seeing how little you kept for yourself while I was in college. It was humbling. Humbling, I repeated. Is that why you came? To tell me you feel humbled? He shook his head. I came to ask about the safe deposit box, the document that can stop the sale of the Vermont property. I need to know what I have to do. If I told you, it would defeat the purpose, I said. This isn't a simple task to complete, Trevor. It's about understanding something fundamental that you've forgotten. I understand that I hurt you, he said, a note of frustration entering his voice. I understand that excluding you from the wedding was wrong. What more do you want from me? I picked up a piece of maple I'd been working with, running my thumb along its grain. Do you know why I love woodworking so much? He blinked at the apparent change of subject. Because Grandpa taught you? Partly, I acknowledged, but mostly because wood has integrity. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. This maple doesn't try to look like mahogany or teak. It's authentically itself, with all its unique grain patterns and imperfections. And those imperfections are what give it character, what make it beautiful. Trevor stared at me, clearly trying to decipher my meaning. When you were growing up, I continued, I tried to teach you the value of authenticity, of being proud of who you are and where you come from. But somewhere along the way, you decided that appearances matter more than substance, that the approval of people like Melissa's parents is worth more than honoring the hands that raised you. It's not that simple, he protested. You don't understand the world I'm living in now. The expectations, I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I understand that you've chosen a world where a person's worth is measured by their bank account and social connections rather than their character. And if that's truly the world you want to live in, then perhaps you deserve to lose the Vermont property, because you wouldn't appreciate what it really represents anyway. He fell silent, staring at his hands that had once learned to build alongside mine, hands that I'd taught to create rather than simply consume. After a long pause, he looked up. So what do I do, Dad? How do I fix this? That's not for me to say, I replied, but I'll give you one hint. The solution isn't about the money. It never was. He left shortly after, clutching the wooden chest like it contained the answer to a riddle he couldn't quite solve. In a way, it did. 3 weeks passed. The deadline for the sale of the Vermont property was now just 19 days away. I'd heard nothing from Trevor since his visit to my workshop, though I'd seen on social media that things appeared tense between him and Melissa. Her posts had become less frequent, and the few photos she shared no longer featured my son. On a Thursday evening, as I was finishing dinner, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Trevor standing on my porch, soaking wet from the rain, his car nowhere in sight. Did you walk here? I asked, stepping aside to let him in. From the bus stop, he said, water dripping from his hair onto my entryway floor. My car's in the shop. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, handing him a towel from the hall closet. I've been thinking about what you said, he continued once he'd dried his face, about authenticity, about not pretending to be something you're not. And, I prompted, gesturing for him to follow me into the kitchen where I poured 2 cups of coffee. I think I understand now. But I need to be sure. He accepted the coffee gratefully. Can I ask you something? About the Vermont property. Go ahead, I said, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. Did you ever consider selling it? Using the money to make your life easier? To retire early? To move into a bigger house? I considered the question carefully. The thought crossed my mind a few times over the years, especially when things were tight after your mother died. But no, I never seriously considered it. Why not? $2 million would have changed your life completely. Some things are worth more than money, Trevor. That land has been in our family for 5 generations. My father took me fishing on that lake every summer. I learned to swim there, to identify trees and birds. I'd hoped to share those same experiences with you someday. And with your children after that. Trevor stared into his coffee. Why didn't you ever tell me about it? Partly because of a promise I made to my father to keep it quiet until the right time, but also because I wanted you to build your own life, make your own way without counting on an inheritance. I didn't want it hanging over your head, influencing your choices. The way Melissa's father's money influenced mine, he said quietly. I said nothing, letting the implications sink in. I've been going back through all the photos in the chest, he continued after a moment. There are so many memories I'd forgotten, or maybe I just stopped valuing them. What do you see when you look at those photos now? I asked. I see a father who was always there, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Who taught me to build things with my own hands, who came to every baseball game and school play, who worked extra jobs to pay for my college applications, who never once made me feel like I was a burden, even when I absolutely was. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, one I recognized immediately. It showed the two of us standing beside a finished bookcase we'd built for Martha when Trevor was about 10. We both wore matching work aprons covered in sawdust, grinning proudly at the camera. "Do you remember this day?" he asked. "Of course. You insisted on doing the sanding yourself, even though your arms got tired halfway through. You wouldn't let me help because it was a gift for your mom, and you wanted to make sure you'd done your share of the work." I was so proud when she cried after we gave it to her, Trevor said, smiling at the memory. "She kept her favorite books on that shelf, right up until until she died. I finished for him. I still have it. You know, it's in the guest room now." Trevor looked up, surprised. "You kept it all these years." "I kept everything you ever made, Trevor. Every Father's Day card, every school art project, every piece of furniture we built together, because those things have value to me that has nothing to do with money. They're pieces of our story together." He was quiet for a long time, staring at the photograph. Finally, he spoke. "Melissa and I have been fighting about the Vermont property. I guessed at first she couldn't understand why I wouldn't just apologize. Promise to include you in future family events, whatever it took to get the property back. When I tried to explain that it wasn't that simple, that there was something deeper I needed to understand first, she got frustrated, said I was choosing sentimentality over our financial future." "And what did you say to that?" I asked carefully. I asked her if she would still want to be with me if her father hadn't given me a job, if we had to live in an apartment instead of a penthouse, if my background was all she got, with no promise of future wealth or connections. He laughed humorlessly. She didn't have an answer. "I'm sorry, son," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I took no pleasure in his marital difficulties. "Don't be," he replied with surprising firmness. "It's forcing me to face some hard truths about the choices I've been making, about who I've become." He stood up suddenly. "I need to show you something. Will you come with me?" "Where to?" I asked, already reaching for my jacket. "My apartment, or what used to be my apartment." Trevor was uncharacteristically quiet during the bus ride to his building. I'd offered to drive, but he'd insisted we take public transportation. "I've been taking the bus everywhere for the past week," he explained. "It's been educational." When we arrived at his luxury hut, the doorman greeted Trevor by name but gave me a suspicious look, taking in my worn work jacket and calloused hands. "It's okay, Edward," Trevor said. "This is my father." The man's eyebrows shot up. "Your father? I didn't know you had." He caught himself. "I mean, it's a pleasure to meet you, sir." I nodded politely as we made our way to the elevator. "Does Melissa know we're coming?" I asked as Trevor pressed the button for the penthouse floor. "Melissa moved out 3 days ago," he replied, avoiding my eyes. "She's staying with her parents until I come to my senses about the property situation." The elevator doors opened directly into their apartment, a massive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The view was undeniably breathtaking, but what caught my attention was what Trevor had done to the sleek, minimalist space I'd glimpsed in their social media photos. The elegant living room had been transformed into a workshop of sorts. Wood shavings covered the pristine marble floors. Tools, many I recognized from my own collection, were arranged carefully on what had once been a dining table worth more than my car, and in the center of it all stood a half-completed piece of furniture, the beginnings of a cradle, from the looks of it. "What is all this?" I asked, taking in the incongruous scene. Trevor ran his hand along the smooth curve of the cradle's rocking base. "After I left your workshop that day, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about authenticity, about creating versus consuming. So I bought some tools, watched some YouTube tutorials, and started building a cradle." I stepped closer to examine his work. The joints were rough, the proportions slightly off, but there was undeniable care in every cut and curve. "Melissa doesn't know yet, but she's pregnant." He looked up at me, a mixture of pride and fear in his eyes. "I'm going to be a father. I found out the day after our wedding, but with everything that happened, I never got around to telling you." The news hit me like a physical force. A grandchild, my grandchild, a new generation I might never have been allowed to know. "Congratulations," I said once I found my voice. "That's wonderful news, is it?" Trevor looked around the half-dismantled luxury apartment. "I'm about to be a father, my marriage is falling apart, and I've realized I have no idea who I actually am, underneath all this." He gestured to encompass the penthouse, the lifestyle, the person he'd been pretending to be. Becoming a parent has a way of clarifying what matters, I said carefully. It did for me. That's why I started building the cradle, he explained, running his fingers along the unfinished wood. I kept thinking about all the things you made for me when I was growing up. How everything in our house had a story behind it, had your hands and heart in it. I want that for my child too. He walked to the window, looking out at the glittering cityscape. I told Melissa's father I needed to take a leave of absence from the company, that I needed time to figure some things out. He didn't take it well. I imagined not, I said, joining him at the window. He said if I wasn't at my desk on Monday, I shouldn't bother coming back at all. That the job was a wedding gift that could be just as easily rescinded. Trevor laughed bitterly, as if I didn't already know that nothing in their world comes without strings. And what did you tell him? I thanked him for the opportunity and said I'd return my key card and company laptop by the end of the week. Trevor turned to face me. I don't want to live like this anymore, Dad. Pretending to be someone I'm not, measuring my worth by the size of my office or the brand of my clothes. That's not how you raised me. No, I agreed quietly. It isn't. I've been thinking about what you said about the Vermont property, he continued, about what it really represents. It's not just land, is it? It's a heritage, a connection to something authentic and enduring. I nodded, something like hope beginning to stir in my chest. And what have you decided to do about it? I don't know yet, he admitted, but I know I need to earn it back the right way. Not just with an apology or a promise, but by remembering who I really am, who we are. He walked back to the half-finished cradle, picking up a piece of sandpaper. Will you help me finish this? I'm making a mess of the curves. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw for the first time in years the boy I'd raised. Beneath the expensive haircut and designer clothes, despite the mistakes and the hurt between us, there he was, trying to find his way back to what mattered. I'd be honored, I said, rolling up my sleeves. For the next few hours, we worked side by side in comfortable silence, the familiar rhythm of creation bridging the gap that had grown between us. As I guided his hands through a particularly tricky cut, I felt something healing that I had feared was broken beyond repair. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Trevor and I fell into an unexpected routine. Each evening after I finished work, he would come to my house or workshop, and we would continue building the cradle together. During these hours, bit by bit, he shared the story of how he'd lost himself in the pursuit of acceptance from Melissa's family. Her father made it clear from the beginning that I would never be good enough unless I assimilated completely, he explained one night as we applied the first coat of finish to the nearly completed cradle. It wasn't enough to marry his daughter. I had to become the kind of man he respected, which meant erasing any trace of my actual background, and Melissa supported this. I asked. Trevor sighed, carefully wiping excess oil from a joint. She never explicitly told me to be ashamed of you, or of how I grew up, but she would make these little comments about how my table manners must come from eating in school cafeterias instead of formal dining rooms, about how quaint it was that I knew how to change a tire or fix a leaky faucet, skills most people in our circle pay others to handle. And you went along with it, I observed, keeping my voice free of judgment. I did more than go along with it, he admitted, shame evident in his voice. I started inventing stories about my childhood, telling her friends I'd attended summer camps I never went to, making it sound like your carpentry business was more successful than it actually was, implying we'd had a vacation home we'd never owned. He set down his rag, looking directly at me. The wedding exclusion wasn't a sudden decision, Dad, it was the culmination of 1,000 small betrayals I'd already committed. By the time they started planning the guest list, I had created a version of my life that had no room for the reality of who we actually are. The honesty hurt, but I appreciated it more than continued deception. The thing is, he continued, I was miserable the entire time, always terrified someone would discover I was faking it, always worried I'd say the wrong thing or reveal some working-class habit that would give me away. I couldn't even enjoy the privileges I thought I wanted because I knew I hadn't earned them. And now, I asked, with the baby coming, his expression softened. Now all I can think about is what kind of father I want to be, what values I want to pass on. He ran his hand over the cradle's smooth surface. I keep thinking about this cradle, and how someday I'll tell my child that their grandfather and I built it together. That seems so much more valuable than saying, your crib came from some high-end baby boutique and cost $3,000. We worked in silence for a while, the only sound the soft brush of cloth against wood. Melissa called yesterday, Trevor said finally. She gave me an ultimatum. Either I fix things with you regarding the property and come back to work for her father, or she file for divorce. She said she didn't sign up to be married to a blue-collar nobody with a workshop in the living room. My heart sank for him. I'm sorry, son, don't be, he replied with surprising steadiness. It made the decision clearer. I told her I needed to be true to myself, to raise our child with the values I believe in. I told her I'd rather be a blue-collar nobody with integrity than continue living a lie. How did she take it? About as well as you'd expect. Her father's lawyers will be contacting me about divorce proceedings next week. He looked up at me, a mixture of grief and determination in his eyes. The thing is, Dad, I'm terrified about the baby, about possibly losing custody, about raising a child in a broken home. Your mother and I taught you what family means, I said gently. Whatever happens with Melissa, you'll do right by your child, like you did for me, he said quietly. The next evening when Trevor arrived at my house, he was carrying a manila envelope. Without a word, he handed it to me and sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Inside was a formal legal letter from Melissa's father's attorneys, outlining the terms of the divorce they were seeking. The language was cold, punitive. They wanted full custody of the child, a complete financial separation, no visitation rights until paternity was established. They're treating me like I'm some gold digger they need to eliminate, Trevor said bitterly, as if I ever wanted their money. What are you going to do? I asked, setting the letter aside. Fight for my child, he said without hesitation. But I need your help. Anything. I promised. I need the document in the safe deposit box, he said, meeting my gaze steadily. Not to save the Vermont property. That doesn't matter to me anymore. But I need whatever resources I can gather to fight this legal battle. I can't let them take my child away. I studied his face, the sincerity, the determination, the traces of the boy I'd raised now visible again in the man before me. Let me ask you something, Trevor. If you had to choose between the Vermont property and the right to be part of your child's life, which would you choose? My child, he answered without hesitation, 100 times over. And what would you want that child to know about their heritage, about where they come from? The truth, he said simply, that they come from a line of people who work with their hands, who build things that last, who value family and integrity over money and appearances. He swallowed hard. That their grandfather is a man who taught their father everything of value he knows, even if it took him too long to remember it. I nodded slowly, reaching a decision. Get your coat, I said. We're going to the bank. The bank was nearly empty as closing time approached. The manager, who knew me from decades of steady business, greeted us warmly and escorted us to the vault area where the safe deposit boxes were kept. It's been a while since you've accessed your box, Mr. Calloway, she commented as she unlocked the outer door. Some things are worth waiting for, I replied, leading Trevor into the small private room once she'd left us alone. I inserted my key into box number 427, the same number as my old house where Trevor had grown up. Inside was a single document in a sealed envelope, which I handed to him without opening. This is it, he asked, turning the envelope over in his hands. The document that can stop the sale of the Vermont property. Yes, I said simply. Open it. With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded the papers inside. As he read, confusion crossed his features, followed by shock, and finally understanding. It wasn't a legal document to stop the sale. It was a deed to the Vermont property, with Trevor's name on it as the sole owner, dated 3 days after he'd called to uninvite me from the wedding. I don't understand, he said, looking up at me. You transferred the property to me, even after what I did. I transferred it to you because of what I hoped you'd remember, I explained. The property was always meant to be yours, Trevor. It's your birthright, your heritage. I just needed you to understand its true value before you took possession. But the trust, the 60-day deadline, Harrison Development Group, all real, I confirmed. Richard set up the trust according to my instructions, with myself as the trustee and you as the beneficiary. The sale to Harrison would have proceeded if you hadn't met the conditions which you have. Which conditions? He asked. I never figured out what I was supposed to do. Didn't you? I smiled slightly. You reconnected with your true self. You chose integrity over appearances. You prioritized family over money. You started building something with your own hands again. You remembered who you are and where you come from. Trevor stared at the deed, his expression unreadable. So I own the Vermont property. Right now. Free and clear. Yes, I said, and while I'd never tell you what to do with it, I hope you'll consider keeping it in the family, taking your child there someday. continuing the traditions my father taught me. That I would have taught you had things been different. I don't deserve this, he said quietly. It's not about deserving, I told him. It's about belonging. That land belongs to you because you belong to it. It's part of your story, your heritage, and now it's part of your child's heritage too. Trevor carefully refolded the deed and placed it back in the envelope. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not just for this, but for not giving up on me. For believing I could remember what matters. I never gave up on you, I assured him. I just needed you to remember who you really are before you lost yourself completely. As we left the bank, Trevor turned to me. I know what I want to do now. With the property? With my life. What's that? I asked. I want to build something, he said with newfound confidence. Something real. Something that will last. The months that followed were difficult but transformative. Trevor's divorce from Melissa became a bitter, public battle. Her family used every connection, every resource to paint him as an unstable, unfit parent. They offered a substantial settlement if he would relinquish custody claims, which he firmly rejected. What they hadn't counted on was the evidence Trevor had meticulously gathered during his marriage. Recordings of conversations where Melissa belittled his background, text messages where she threatened to keep the baby from him if he didn't comply with her family's expectations, witnesses who could testify to her statements about never allowing a child of hers to be contaminated by working-class values. Nor had they anticipated that the Vermont property now legally Trevor's would provide him with the financial leverage to hire attorneys as skilled as theirs. Not that he needed to sell it, merely using it as collateral for a loan gave him the resources to fight on equal footing. I stood by him through every hearing, every deposition, a silent but constant presence. And when the judge finally ruled joint custody, with Trevor having primary physical custody until the child turned 5, I was there to see the relief and vindication wash over my son's face. She doesn't even want the baby, Trevor confided as we left the courthouse. She just couldn't stand losing to someone she considers beneath her. Her loss, I said simply, in more ways than one. In the weeks before his daughter's birth, Trevor made a decision that surprised even me. He sold his share in the penthouse condo, liquidated his investments, and purchased a modest house not far from mine. 3 bedrooms, a fenced yard, and most importantly, a detached garage he immediately converted into a workshop. I want Emma to grow up with sawdust under her fingernails, he explained as we set up his tools. I want her to know the satisfaction of building something with her own hands. Emma Rose Calloway was born on a crisp autumn morning, a tiny perfect thing with her father's eyes and a determined set to her jaw that reminded me painfully of Martha. The first time I held her, watching her tiny fingers curl around my calloused thumb, I felt the completion of a circle that had almost been broken beyond repair. I have something for you both, I told Trevor that evening, as he sat in the hospital room, gently rocking his daughter. I handed him a small wooden box, one I'd made specifically for this moment, inlaid with maple and cherry, in a pattern that matched the cradle we'd built together. Inside was a key and a hand-drawn map. What's this? He asked. The key to the cabin, I said. The one I started building on the Vermont property last month. Nothing fancy yet, just a simple structure on the lake shore. But I thought maybe, when Emma's a little older, we could finish it together, the 3 of us. Trevor looked from the key to his sleeping daughter and back to me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I'd like that, he said softly. Very much. 6 months later, on a perfect June day, we made our first trip to the Vermont property together. Emma was too young to remember, of course, but I took dozens of photos as Trevor carried her down to the lake, pointing out birds and trees, already teaching her the names of things that would become part of her heritage. That evening, as we sat on the cabin's porch watching the sunset turn the lake to gold, Trevor turned to me. I understand now, he said, what you were trying to teach me about true wealth. And what's that? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully against his chest, her tiny hand curled around his finger. This, he said simply, family, heritage, a sense of belonging to something authentic and enduring, things you can't buy, only build and preserve. That's the real inheritance, I agreed, the one that matters. I almost lost it, he said quietly, almost traded it away for things that don't last. But you didn't, I reminded him. When it counted most, you remembered what matters. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared above the lake, I thought about the journey we'd taken from estrangement to reconciliation, from superficial values to enduring ones. The path hadn't been easy or straightforward. but we'd found our way back to what mattered. In the end, the gift Trevor had regretted refusing wasn't the Vermont property itself. It was the wisdom to recognize what truly constitutes wealth in this life, not money or status or appearances, but the authentic connections we build, the values we uphold, and the love we pass on to the next generation. Emma stirred in her father's arms, opening eyes that already seemed to hold the wisdom of her ancestors. Looking at her, at my son, at the legacy we were rebuilding together, I knew that our story would continue, not without challenges or disagreements, but with a solid foundation that could weather any storm. True wealth, indeed. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring more content like this to listeners worldwide.